Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the channel. I'm joined with Elizabeth today. Welcome to the channel, Elizabeth.
Hi, how are you?
Pretty good. So today, everybody, we're going to talk about the tarot, different forms, and also the runes, and divination in general. So, Elizabeth, what particular system of tarot do you follow? What kind of deck do you use? How do you do this form of divination that is the tarot?
So I use the traditional major minor arcana system. It is 74 cards, 22 major arcana, 52 or 54, maybe 50, sorry, I always get these numbers. I have numeric dyslexia, but it's
It's
about
okay.
70 something cards, 50 something odd minor arcana, 22 major. And I use either typically, I have a variety of decks, but I mainly either refer to the Rider-Waite tarot or the Thoth tarot, created by Aleister Crowley and Lady Frida Harris.
How did you start? What made you either want to go into tarot and divination, or how did your spiritual journey that took this path kind of develop? What need was it trying to satisfy, or was it just interest? Tell us a little bit about that.
I think it was a combination of being in a positive environment for it. My mother reads, but she reads an entirely different system, the Madame Normand method. I have no idea how to read it. It's got totally different
Hmm.
symbols involved, but I always grew up in a very sort of open-minded environment. It was never pressed upon me, but like the materials and the access to it were always around, and I had elders I could talk to and refer to, and resources I could reference for it.
Hmm. So, do you do readings for other people? And like, if you're gonna do like a basic reading, maybe you can kind of tell how that works because I know people have different layouts, different ways to employ the cards, different ways that some people like for the person that they're doing a reading for to point the cards out or even to grab them themselves. How would you do? Basically, how would you do a reading using your form of tarot for someone else?
So I'm pretty old school. I use the Celtic cross. That's like it's six cards laid out in a cross with a center smaller cross in it. The
Mm-hmm.
issue, what's crossing it, the head, the foundation. People have different ways of aligning the different cards, but the it looks the same, but different people have different interpretations for the different positions. But I do the cross and then like the little tower sort of summarization, that addresses hopes and fears and sort of immediate past, immediate present, what's going on in your mind, what your foundation is, and what the possible outcome is. I believe there are many uses for tarot, and it's a little more multifaceted than just like telling the future. I actually believe it's kind of a little more tricky to do that because I think that lines of fate are relatively easy to follow in the general broad sense of it. Usually I'll sit down with a client and I'll have them take a breath in with me. If they're present with me, I'll have them shuffle the cards in front of me. If they're not, if it's through video call or phone, I'll shuffle for them and sort of focus heavily, try to put myself in their position or their shoes and sort of meld my consciousness a little bit with them. But I can typically tell once I lay out the cards, even if I don't know anything about this person, and I'm not boasting here, it's pretty once you sort of get a feel for it, I've had astounding moments where I've just said to people like, has your husband just died, like, or have you gone through a breakup, or are you worried about your health or whatever. Sometimes they tell me, sometimes they don't. They just sort of let me read out on it. But tarot essentially is a symbol lexicon to tell the story of your life. So sometimes a lot of my readings are mostly just psychologically affirming to my clients and saying, I had a reading recently with someone who wanted to know if they're on the right path for sort of healing a lot of psychological wounds that he was addressing, and that kind of it didn't really delve into his job, his work, his relationship, whatever. It mostly just focused on that. However, I feel sometimes if you ask them a certain question and there's something more pressing going on, the cards will say like, okay, yeah, you're on the right track, or oh, you can put this on hold for a second. Here's what's going on, this other thing. And I can typically get a feel for that. All the suits have different connotations for the things that they address typically, though there's some overlap. There's a lot of overlap actually. But typically, wands has to do with like ideas and creativity. It's more creative projects or intellectual, like, or how you present yourself in social settings. Swords also have to do with the intellect, but more inward intellect and more like hard facts, science, stuff like that. things are trying to deduce by, evidence or research or observation. Cups are more emotional based. Pentacles have to do more with finances or work and things like that. And it's kind of just like an overlapping, like circle Venn diagram of things that are going on. And based on that layout and the major themes that are brought up by the major arcana, I can typically tell what's going on.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, like, just for people who really don't know about divination or anything like that, what are some questions that clients come at you with? Just like some just examples. You don't have to name specific people, but just examples in general as far as what people are coming to you to basically figure out.
It's a large range. You get a lot of the classic, what's going on with this guy I'm seeing. Sometimes you get a lot of some of the more heartbreaking ones have to deal with like child custody battles, divorces, things like that. I deal with a lot of pain, a lot of anguish, and I try consciously to diffuse that from my energy after I read. Otherwise, I get terrible migraines or just weird shit happens to me. And it's sorry, I shouldn't curse in the podcast, but sudden accidents occurred. It's just not good. So typically I was taught to, always wash my hands with cold water and wipe the back of my neck with a washcloth. Different people have different methods, but that's mine. But sometimes it's really people just want to know what the cards could tell them if there's just like, a message waiting in the inbox of, the divine symbol lexicon. So sometimes it's just laying out and, it's just telling the story of their lives back to them. And it's really affirming for some people to be seen in a kind of spiritually vulnerable way in that aspect, or psychological, Jungian kind of way. And I found a lot of readings that are more just affirmations than anything are some of the most fulfilling ones that I do. I was going to finish my line of thought. I totally got lost in a tangent.
That's okay.
You're saying?
No, I mean, you can continue, but I'll just have two questions that are kind of a segue into runes. But I mean, you can finish what your thought was if you got it.
Oh, I was going to say, I believe you can sort of accurately foretell like lines of fate, but that if any variable after you perform the divination changes, it totally skews the way it manifests. So you can accurately divine what's going to happen based on the exact moment you divine that, in my opinion. This is just my opinion. Who knows? But I've noticed that I make a point to see other diviners and sort of appreciate their systems and just have them read me because, like any therapist, you can't wholly psychoanalyze yourself. So I would go see other diviners. I've had people have what I call near miss predictions in my mind, predicting things that have almost happened within a very accurate time frame of when they would happen if things had worked out in that way. And so it's caused me to sort of believe that, yes, you can quasi-accurately predict the future, only in so much those variables that are in place stay exactly on the course that they are.
So I'm not sure if you can do this, but can you cast spells with the tarot? Is that even possible? Or is that something you've never heard of?
No, I've definitely heard it. I've incorporated tarot cards into my spell altars. Like, for example, if I'm trying to manifest a particular energy or a particular outcome, I will choose from one of my decks an energy that I feel like would help that. Much like with rune work. I'm not particularly versed in rune spell work in the traditional sense. I want to learn more about that. But much like someone would draw a rune on their forehead or have an image of it before them while they were performing the spell, or if that was the whole of the spell, I will use a tarot card and place it on my altar to sort of channel that same energy.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. So, also another question: have you ever used the tarot to speak with the dead, or is that something that you haven't heard of? I haven't really heard of it being used very often, but it always fascinates me when I hear cases where the tarot is used to communicate with those who have passed on, but still a part of them remains here, just a little part of themselves. So have you tried to communicate with the dead with the tarot?
It's not my specialty per se, but I do remember a particular reading. It was just a cold reading. I was at an event and an older woman sat down in front of me, and that was actually the exact instance where I was actually shocked that I was able to accurately sort of call this out. But her husband had just died, and I think that a lot of that reading was geared towards sort of honoring his memory and his spirit and tying up ends to her satisfaction and dealing with their children and the family. And I think at some points I was able to, because often I'll do a Celtic cross and then I'll build on it for more clarification. So I'll draw additional cards to elaborate on certain things and aspects. And I think there was a point where I drew cards based on what his spirit was, wanting to commune with her. But it wasn't something I sat down and was like, all right, today we're gonna do necromancy, with my tarot. Like,
No, that's completely understandable. So, I mean, I guess at this point we can kind of segue into, of course, I have a lot of ideas on the runes, but I know that you have some interest in the runes now. How did that interest start? And maybe you can just kind of talk about some of what you found early on as when it comes to the runes, because we all have this path that really weirdly led us to the runes or tarot or something like that. What was the thing that led you to the runes, or even sparked your interest in the runes in general?
it's interesting. I like to think in some ways the runes kind of extended themselves towards me a little bit. They were kind of always in my peripheral awareness. One of the people I go to every year for a reading, she utilizes runes as well as a bunch of other decks. Her readings are very long. They're often hours. And
Mm-hmm.
I'd always drawn runes for my reading and never really quite invested, like, oh, what do those mean? I recognized some of them and I would go based on what she said, but I wasn't thinking too hard. So they kind of like subconsciously seeped into my awareness. Someone
So
else.
Is it Elder Futhark you're working with, or is
Elder
it?
Futhark,
Okay.
definitely. I've never worked with, and I've never seen anyone work with any other system. Maybe I'm wrong, but I had another friend of mine who I worked with on a lot of different magic. But she used runes, and she was a sacred tattooer, and she self-tattooed runes on her
Mm-hmm.
hands and things like that, and utilized it in some of her writing. Even she would pair it with English, and base her lettering on it. But I still never asked, and we haven't talked in a year or so. But I like to think that her bringing that around me kind of invigorated that interest. More than anything, I think that I really wanted to grasp something that I could call indigenous to my ancestral line, and I'm pretty white, so I'm pretty Scandinavian. It turns out my mother is a historian, and she does genealogical research sometimes, and she tested my father and her, and they found out we're pretty much like 99.9% like North European, Viking, English, whatever. We came to England with King William the Conqueror, the Danish invasion, and settled in Ireland and whatnot. But I feel like it was a way to connect to my roots and my pre-Christian ancestors, and to have a traditional magic in my own right that didn't really have its heyday in like the 1800s.
That makes sense. I mean, it's difficult for a lot of people to find that connection to their ancestors, and the runes, they're a really great way to do that. I have mostly Northwestern European as well in my blood. I mean, I just got my Ancestry.com results back today, and I was surprised by a few things. Apparently, I'm 14% Native American, 5% Black with Nigerian and Congo, and but most of my Native American is Aztec and Comanche. But yeah, basically, I'm mostly northwestern Europe. But I would like to say to anybody that you don't have to have certain blood in you to work with the runes or tarot, in my opinion. You can take up any system that you want. You can take up any gods or spirits that you want. It's more about what you're drawn to, not necessarily what's in your blood, because I believe in reincarnation. A lot of us, like, yeah, we've been reincarnated as many different people in many different cultures. And when it comes to, there's this idea of a folk soul. So a lot of folkish, I guess you could say, Ossetoire or Odinists, they have this idea that reincarnation exists, but it's only within your folk spirit. So you're always reincarnated as whites, but I've not found that to be true at all. But yeah, that's just kind of a little bit of racism that seeped in. It seems like Odinism, that name Odinism, has been completely taken by racist people, unfortunately. Even though I follow Odin, when I start talking about Odinism, you get a bunch of white nationalists and people who don't really seem to care about Odin. They're just more focused on their blood and their ancestry, but they don't really have a lot of spiritual practices and stuff like that. But yeah, it's so yeah, anybody could take up any form, and I highly recommend the runes to almost anybody. I mean, it's wonderful. The Elder Futhark, especially in my mind, is a very good set of spirits to work with. And first and foremost, I would say that runes are primordial spirits that when they crisscross, they make the fabric of reality. They're often called the gods of the gods because they existed before even gods were formed. These are primordial spirits, and how we draw them isn't as important as tapping into that particular spirit, that primordial force that symbol represents. The Elder Futhark is a great place to see which runes you want to start off with learning about, and then slowly learn them all, and have a really deep connection to these different forces, these different threads that make up reality. So, do you have your runic set with you? I mean, okay, maybe you can show yours and talk about yours for a minute, and then I'll show mine as well.
Cool. So I think it's really important that you mention it because, I think when there's a problem within a collective that needs to be addressed, it can't just be swept under the rug. And
yeah,
I will say, the person who first introduced me to the runes, I think, is of mostly the Yoruba tradition. She's very much African, Uversa Mbadua, great lady. She reads for me, but she uses the runes very, very with a lot of familiarity and a lot of reverence and a lot of love, and I think that her using them is an affirmation of their universality, and I think it's really interesting. I actually never heard them called the gods of the gods until you had.
It's from a very old text, but I can't remember what text it is. But yeah,
I haven't read extensively on them. I've mostly been drawing from Diana Paxson's books so far, but I want to extend more of my knowledge into Scandinavian literature and more references on that. But my runes, they're in this black velvet bag. Taking out.
Hey, I got a black velvet bag too. Awesome.
They're goat bone. I got them at Catland Books in Bushwick, Brooklyn, New York.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a wonderful way to describe them, though, because I think that is a really interesting thought-provoking aspect. Because I think I like to tie them back to stories, and I don't have a story for all the runes. I haven't really quite connected to all of them yet, but I like to think about, there's one rune, I wonder if I can draw it out. If you're out and pick it up, called Awaz, which is, it looks like an M, but it's supposed to be two horses sort of meeting.
Oh, you're talking about Awaz versus Iwaz. Iwaz, they sound very similar, but yeah, Awaz is definitely what you're talking about.
The pronunciation is lost upon me.
No, you said it right. You said it right. It's just these two runes sound very similar, so for years I got them confused. But yeah,
they are spelled very similar. For reference, they're for the audience, they're EHWAZ and EIWAZ, I think, right? Yeah. But this guy right here looks like an M. We can all see it.
Horse.
Yeah, this is a story of my grandparents. They met while riding horses, so I feel very connected to that rune of, like, if I was to have that, I plan to have runes tattooed on me likewise, and I want that to be the first one because I feel like it's like part of my origin and my lineage. To an extent, I work a lot with Fehu, which I've made jokes about before. When I first encountered the runes, I was pretty frustrated with them actually because I didn't find them as illuminating or they didn't speak to me as readily as the tarot did. With the tarot, you have, with the Rider-Waite, you have people doing things, people fighting with sticks, people crying, walking in the ocean, people waving swords at each other. Things are going on. You don't really have that with the runes. They're just lines that make, it's an alphabet. So I had a lot of jokes that the runes were all fertility and abundance, and occasionally get an interesting one like stagnation. And my relationship to them was a little begrudging, and I learned about them in fits and starts. But Fehu I use a lot in prosperity rituals, or to sort of like activate or give a little more of a to charge some of my spells a little bit more. Sometimes paired with Uruz, which is the next letter in the Ayat.
You know what? This is we should talk about more of this information. I'm okay to make a part 2 if you're down to make a part 2. I just want to end this before we hit the 20 mark.
Yeah.
Does that work? All right. Absolutely. So hey everybody, thank you very much for watching. This has been part 1. I wanted to thank Elizabeth once again for joining me on the channel. And you will see part 2 very soon, assuming that you look at the other video. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see all of you in a minute.